From the bedroom to the boardroom and in all the hallways in between, we are designing conversations on a daily basis. And perhaps one of the most neglected but most important conversation of all is the one we have with ourselves. The question is, how intentional are we though about the design of these conversations? When I came across today's guest, Daniel Stillman, it occurred to me that despite not only having but leading conversations day in and day out, no one had ever really taught me the art of how to design one, and nor had I really even sought out how to design one myself. Unlike most other areas where technology has eliminated previous methods or made them significantly less desirable, communication is an area where the number of choices keeps increasing. Today, not only do we have the challenge of knowing when, what type of communication is appropriate, but also how best to facilitate a conversation through that medium or platform can be equally as daunting. When should I write an email? What's the difference between a LinkedIn post, a Twitter post, or an Instagram post? When should I use an emoji? When and where are things appropriate? Should I make a phone call? Should I meet with someone face to face? How can I better engage with people across all the different platforms where I want to reach my audience? I mean, the list of how and where to ignite a conversation is endless. And so I'm so excited to introduce you to today's guest, who's here to share his method to the madness. While the number of choices and how best to utilize them can seem daunting, the opportunity it presents for anyone to have a voice and share their ideas is incredible. Leadership today, as I'm sure you heard, is not just about having a title or a role. What you really need today is the ability to ignite conversations around your ideas and your interests to achieve the outcomes you desire. It's my pleasure to introduce you today to Daniel Stillman. Daniel designs conversations for a living and insists that you do too. As an independent design facilitator, he works with clients and organizations of all shapes and sizes, from Google to Visa and many more to name a few. He helps them frame and sustain productive and collaborative conversations, deepen their facilitation skills, and coach them through the innovation process. His first book, The Paper Airplane Experiment and the 30-Second Elephant, is about origami and teams. And yes, it's as strange as it sounds. Daniel also hosts The Conversation Factory, a podcast where he interviews leaders, changemakers, and innovators on how they design the conversations in their work and lives. He's here today to share how we can better design conversations and also give us a preview inside his new book, Good Talk: How to Design Conversations That Matter, releasing exactly 1 month from today on April 2nd. If you haven't had a chance already, I'd love if you could take a moment to rate and review the show. It's through that I'm able to get guests like Daniel on here to be able to bring value and share these great ideas and strategies and stories with you week after week. Thanks everyone for all your support, and join me now for my conversation with Daniel Stillman.
How do you navigate change? It's a question we think about often, and one that today's world expects us to be comfortable with. The challenge, however, is where do you begin, and how do you develop the mindset and skill set to be successful? Welcome, everyone, to the Sprint to Success with Design Thinking podcast. I'm your host, Saba Kidwai. Join me each week as I share the stories and strategies from the world's leading researchers and practitioners about why they believe the answer lies in practicing design thinking.
Hi, Daniel. Welcome to Sprint to Success, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, it's so interesting. When people think about design thinking, so often they think about the making or the product or, the outcome or something physical perhaps. But one of the things that I would really love to kind of just start off with is having you introduce yourself and really just kind of sharing your experience and vision and really just your definition of what design means to you.
Yeah, well, so let's start there. Design is one of these sort of hilariously provocative words. I was talking to a friend of mine who's working on a book, and he was told to not use the word design in the title because it would exclude some people. And design is definitely something that we think of as, there's this classical definition that design is making things look better, and to design is to make a design for a design. I studied industrial design, which is like designing objects for mass manufacture, but we've all been designing for a long time. So like design as a maybe this is going too far back, but design is like a job is really recent, right? So we've been making things intentionally as people for a really long time. And Herb Simon's definition, Nobel laureate Herb Simon, has probably got the most broad and cool definition of design, which is to devise courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. And
Oh,
I like to summarize that when I teach design thinking to people. I ask, raise your hand if you're allowed to make things worse on purpose in your job. And then nobody's hand goes up. Like, who here, raise your hand if your job is to make things better by accident. Right? And then we're left with like that third part of the Venn diagram, which is making things better on purpose. And that's design. And so I think everybody designs something in their life, whether it's um, your wedding or a party or a meal. Like, we design, everything we do is designed in some way, shape, or form. And whenever there's intentionality, there's design.
I absolutely love that. And it's one of the things that's so fascinating is hearing how different people define design. But that idea that you have of making things better on purpose, I think is so succinct. I love that. So,
Thanks.
yeah, no. So tell me, Daniel, at what point, because like I shared a little bit with the audience in the introduction that everything for you is about the art and design of a conversation. So tell me at what point or what experience led you to think about, wow, we need to start making conversations better on purpose.
Well, I mean, as soon as I got out of design school and I started working in a design consultancy, I was hit over the head with all the stuff that nobody teaches you in design school, which is the business part, the client management part, the just navigating. Okay, well, we want to do, what's the future of blank? And you're like, well, what do you mean by that? And what's your goal? And how long do we have to do this? And how big is your vision? And by the way, we need to talk to customers and all these different stakeholders and find out what they think and know and mean. And so I don't think I knew or called what I did designing conversations, but there were surely a lot of conversations that needed to get designed. And you get a crash course in designing them once you're out in the real world. It wasn't until much, much later that I worked with a group in Australia called Second Road. They're a consultancy that they're actually acquired by Accenture maybe a year ago. They called their facilitative practice conversation design, which I thought was a very absurd concept when I first heard it. I was like, you're not designers, and what the hell does that even mean? And but it really tickled my brain and got me thinking, well, what is a conversation made out of? And if we are designing it, and I started to open my eyes to this idea that all along that's what I was doing. Was every time I was making an agenda, I was designing the conversation. Every time I made a discussion guide to talk to customers, I was designing the conversation. Every time I coached one of my clients on when to step in and when to wait a little bit in the customer interviews, I was designing the conversation. And so that was just like, on the absolute like basic level, I was like, wow, this is, what have I been designing for? Right? Because when we talk about design implies this purpose. And so the question is like, what are you designing for? In industrial design, we're designing for mass manufacture. In user experience design, where I worked for a number of years, you're generally designing for a digital experience. And when you start doing service design, you're designing all these touch points that you're coordinating to make an experience. And so are you designing for ease? Are you designing for profitability? Are you designing for joy? Right? And so this design, the flip side of design, I guess, is thinking about like, what's your heuristic? Like, what's your rule of thumb? Like, to what end are you designing these things that you're designing? And I think generally in design thinking, for many years, I was designing my conversations for speed and efficacy, right? And it was only in the last couple of years that I've discovered you can design your conversations for connection and slowing down and meaning and significance and purpose and all those other things that lots of other people design their conversations for that naturally.
Yeah, and I love that, and it's like you said as well, it's something that, you don't always think of, but yet we are always doing, and it was one of the parts in your book that I actually really liked, and I know we hear this all the time, but the fact that you were able to make a connection between these 2 ideas I thought was really significant, and that one was the idea that today anyone can really be a leader.
Yeah.
And so I feel like a lot of times with design, sometimes there's this, like, barrier where, not everyone really sees themselves as a designer, and, there's obviously different, types of designers and different roles and whatnot. But I'd love if you could start off kind of with this idea about how, as individuals, we carry out conversations. And, I really enjoy your email newsletter. And I think one of the ones you sent recently was about the conversation that takes place between your 2 ears. It's the one that
Yeah.
you have with yourself. And so I'd love if you could start off by taking us through kind of like, how as individuals we relate to conversations and your ideas around that.
Well, there was a lot of questions in there. And so I'll try to peel them apart. Um, yeah. So, I mean, the conversation with ourselves. Well, so there's two things that I want to address there. One is like that we all are leaders in the sense that in a conversation, in a meeting, no one can actually stop you from talking. Like right now, you could mute me, right? Because you're in control of this interface that our conversation is in, right? Conversations have this place here in this digital realm where you actually have some control. You can hang up, right? You don't have to listen to me, but you can't stop me from talking. You might not like what I'm going to say, but I can say what's on my mind. It's
Right.
really only like what keeps us from saying what we think ought to be said is fear. And fear, the flip side of fear is usually fear of something. A person has power over us. Like in our personal relationships, we're afraid to say something to our significant other because they might not love us anymore. They'll leave. We're afraid to say something to our boss because maybe they'll fire us. We're afraid to say something in a group of people because we won't be understood and we'll feel ostracized. And so we have the physical power of speech, but there's these other things that are keeping us from speaking. um, it's funny. There's like, as soon as you, and this is a total tangent and I apologize, but one of my favorite movies is this movie called Tampopo. It's this Japanese classic about a woman who wants to become the best ramen chef she can. And it's a very weird movie. I saw it way too young. And if you watch it, you'll understand why. But there's a scene where there's a group of people ordering a meal. It's in Japan. There's this group of men, and there's clearly like some older executive types, and then there's this like young guy with like his hair's a mess, and he's like carrying everybody's binders, and they sit down to this meal, and the waiter goes and asks somebody what they'd like to eat. It's a super fancy French restaurant. They're in a private room. And the first guy's like, oh, I don't know. Give me a second. And like a third guy's like, oh, I don't know. Give me a second. And then the third guy's like, okay, well, I'll have the salad and the soup. He orders something pretty simple, and he orders like a Heineken, like not what you would order at like the super fancy French restaurant. And as soon as he places that order, the next guy sort of like hems and haws, but he winds up ordering the same thing. And then like everybody just does the same thing after that, like everybody, until you get to this young guy. And the young guy goes to the waiter. He goes, I see you have quenelles made in this particular style. Did your chef study at such and such place? And the waiter's like, you're very well informed, sir. Yes, he did do this. And so the guy starts to order this ridiculous meal just perfectly from the menu. And the waiter's super impressed. Meanwhile, his boss is kicking him in the shins nonstop because he's speaking out of turn. He's not going along with what everyone else has done. And he literally ignores his boss kicking him in the shins. because he's like, I'm here in this amazing French restaurant. I've got this amazing chef in the back. I've got this maitre d' here who knows what he's talking about. And I'm just going to order the perfect meal, from the wine to the dessert to the cheese course. And the waiter's like, very good, sir. Excellent order. And everybody in the room is like so ashamed that they just ordered this totally average meal and didn't ask any questions of the waiter and just totally missed their opportunity. And I love that moment because I think life is definitely like that. This kid was being kicked in the shins by his boss. And his choice was, um, shut up or not. And he was like, I'm just going to order the best meal I can. And so I feel
Right.
like every day we are faced with these options, and it is not easy, because who knows if he got fired after that scene, because they do a cut and we never actually find out what happens to him. And this is what's up. So what was the conversation he was having with himself, right? What
Right.
was he obviously he noticed he was being kicked in the shins, right? And maybe he was worried, and maybe he was brave, and maybe he was stupid. I don't know. And so, but I feel like we have these choices that are available to us. And one of the things that I think that's important in the book is that some people don't see certain choices. So there's two levels of the conversation we have with ourselves. There's like, who's in the conversation? Like the voice that says, oh, I have to be perfect in order to start. Not hypothetical at all. We all have that. It's like, oh, I have to be perfect in order to start. And I have to be perfect in order for it to matter. And the just do it voice. But there isn't like a third or fourth voice sometimes. We have just this limited set of voices that we have a dialogue with, usually over and over and over again. And that's what therapy is for. And that's why people go to retreats, and why people take, drugs, to try and kickstart their brains into like having a new set of voices in the room. Uh, One of the things that I've learned in my own therapy is there's inner voice work, and there's inner family system work, where you try to actually have a conversation with those voices, instead of just being like, oh God, you're right, there is no point for me to do this, right? Because I've got that voice in
Right.
my head that says like, oh dude, nobody cares, like there's just no point. And then I go, oh, you're totally right, voice that is telling me that nobody cares. The and instead of saying, well, why do you think that nobody cares, and what's the evidence, what's your evidence, treating it like we would treat a negotiation with a tough negotiator,
Right.
right? And
So
yeah, sorry, please, I'll
oh no,
break in, stop me, for God's sakes,
no,
because I could just.
no. I just think that that's such a powerful idea. And I think it's something that, even the best of us struggle with. So I think even the people who are out there doing all of these things struggle with it. So, like, I can't even imagine what it's like for people that, don't even know how to sort of take that step, but have an idea and want to do something and want to be able to overcome that fear. I don't know if this is a good place to talk about the conversation OS, but we can wait as well if you think that's better. But what strategies would you share for somebody you're stuck in that place, and you have that voice and you either want to become more self aware or you want to be able to shift the dialogue that you're having?
Yeah.
What are some strategies that you might
Well,
suggest to
yeah.
be
So
able to
this is
tackle that?
and thank you for bringing it up, because like I was super nervous about making the conversation OS canvas, because it's not, the term MISI, mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. It's a great acronym. Uh,
Yeah.
and the idea that, in order to have a true data set, or a true set of vectors to like solve the challenge, we have to have this totally perfect data set. But as I was, the last couple of years, while I've been thinking these thoughts and doing the research, and hosting my own podcast, I've been trying to like find ways to bring in this conversation design perspective into my facilitation work. And one day in a workshop, I write up the smallest set of things that I thought mattered. And so I would just ask you, like, when you're designing a conversation, what do you think you actually are designing? What are designable elements? What are addressable elements in a conversation? Like, let's just talk about it. Like,
I
what do you think is addressable?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that I try to look for when designing conversations is emotions.
Yes.
How do you feel about something? Because so much, I think, oftentimes, especially I think today, what many people are tasked with is designing for change,
Mm,
designing for things that many of us are uncomfortable with. And so I think, the people who are, either experimental or okay with trying something new, oftentimes, kind of like me, get placed in these situations where you're doing something because it's either a passion or you just enjoy it, but you haven't really thought so much about the intentionality of
mm,
design.
yeah, very
Like I
much
said,
so.
that's why yeah, I mean, that's why, your work really struck me. So for me, one of the things I look for is how do I help people bring emotions to the forefront
Yeah.
about what they're thinking and feeling so we can address those through a conversation.
Yeah. So like there's actually we've talked about emotions and intentions and people, right? Those are at least
Right,
three things that are addressable in conversations for sure. Conversations have a time and a place. When we design an agenda, we're designing like how much time are we going to give to each thing. That's like some of these like
right,
really basic elements of like, well, should we talk about how we feel about it for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 20 minutes or the whole time? Right.
right.
One of the reasons why,
Or
oh, sorry,
another
go ahead.
one No, I was just gonna say another one I really struggle with is how often I mean, even if I'm thinking about my classes, the time for reflection, the time for talking, the time for sharing, the time for actually having that dialogue and processing is the one I feel like that gets cut the most.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. You're not wrong. And people don't like usually talking about emotions. No, emotions are actually not on the conversation OS because I find that they're actually hard to touch and feel. Uh, I would place them inside of this broader idea of what's the invitation to the conversation, because we've all been in conversations where people are like, "I'm angry at you," right?
Yeah, yeah,
It's
right?
like, "I'm unhappy with your performance so far." Uh, employee, boyfriend, or family member. It's the same
Yeah.
conversation of like you haven't been, coming to. That's not actually a great way to start a conversation. Um,
But it so often is though, isn't it?
yeah,
Especially if you think about personal lives or even really in the workplace. Sometimes it's like so much bent up frustration,
yeah,
that then, explodes and,
right. But
really
is that? But
unintentionally
right,
gets dark.
and when will that ever get us what we want and need? Right. So
Right,
that's where I say like,
exactly.
what's a safe invitation into the topic? If we say like, how might I express my disappointment with you? Uh, that's not really how might we question that anybody. It's like, how might we discuss how we feel about the state of the kitchen right now? Right. And I joke, and I talked about this recently. My fiance, who I love very much, took the. I was in the room and I was like, "What is that scraping metal noise in the house?" And it was she was taking out the ironing board, which I never use. I have one because it's a good idea to have one. I like rarely ever use it, and I was like, "Oh wow!" She's like, "Yeah, yeah, I'm gonna do some ironing. Uh, I have some stuff that I want to iron. So I'm just going to hang it on the ironing board and I'm going to get to it." I'm like, "Cool." So like 2 days later, I was like, "Hey honey, how's it going with your ironing project?" Right. And she was like, she's like, "Well, I'm getting ready to get started to start doing it." And I was like, "Take me through that process. Tell me more." And she was like, "Yeah, it's a good point." And it's like it's a really different way of it's a loving way of starting the conversation of like, "Hey, what's," as opposed to "What's the goddamn ironing board still doing out?" Because I don't really care. I care about
Right.
her, right? And this is what people often tell you. I just started watching the Formula One series on Netflix because a friend of mine, Jurian, wrote a book called Formula X about how Formula One racing is an amazing analogy for organization design. Not for nothing,
Okay.
Formula One is the largest team sport in the world, and when something goes wrong, when somebody attaches a tire to the car and poorly, and the car runs off, and the tire flies off and hits someone in the head, and they lose the race, they don't actually fire that guy. They actually just want to find out what happened because they really need to know what happened, and they need to make him better, and they also need to discover that it was actually not him. It was like four other things that went wrong. It was the bolt, it was visual communication, it was auditory communication, it was their practices, procedures, and principles. You don't just fire somebody because they made a mistake. You have a conversation about what they think happened and what really went on if you want things to be better.
Right,
that's this question
absolutely.
of like, what are we designing conversations with and for, right? Like I always say, the elements in the conversation OS, like the interface for the conversation. There's a reason why we go up to the wall to do a retrospective and say, here's everything that happened. Here's all of the people who were involved, right? And here's all of the points where it failed, so that we can have a spatio-temporal understanding of what happened instead of just a verbal one. Conversations that are just verbal get really hot sometimes, really fast,
Right,
right? And
right.
so that's one of the reasons why I like to design conversations to be visual, because it slows them down, right? The cadence of a conversation, the speed of a conversation is really hard to control if you don't know how to manage yourself, right?
So tell us a little bit about that. Like, how do you then make conversations visual?
Yeah, I mean, we joke that sticky notes are like, what people think design thinking is all about.
Right,
Sticky notes are this like unique size that when you use a thick pen, you can kind of fit like one idea on it, and they're restickable, which means we can move stuff around. And I interviewed a lovely woman on my podcast recently, Esther Derby, and she was the one who really hit me to this idea. I'd never realized how poorly we are designed for temporal awareness. Human beings are really small creatures, right? We when we're trying to look at systemic problems, we just really look at the tip of the iceberg of like what happened, but we don't
right,
look at what's underneath that moment that happened. And that's why doing something like a fishbone diagram or a problem tree analysis, all of these visual tools that we have available to us, shift a conversation so that it is slowed down, so that we're all talking and seeing the same thing, right? And we don't get too hot too fast. And there's a story in my book that I pawned from Amanda Palmer. I don't know if you're familiar with her work.
a little bit.
She gave a very well watched TED talk on I think it's called The Art of Asking. She used to work as a somebody who just like got in one of those weird costumes and just like a human statue who would just like stand there still and just like put out a hand and ask people to, take a paper rose and give her some money. And she talked about how she decided to have a meal with her husband, Neil Gaiman, who's like super cool. And she decided one day to be like, hey, let's have a silent dinner, but pass notes, right? Like, let's doodle our conversation. And so they got a pen and paper from the waiter, and they had this written conversation. And it's like these famous epistolatory romances, right? That you expressing yourself in words is very, very different than expressing yourself in speech. We can choose our words. And when we
Right,
have a verbal conversation and somebody says to you like, what went wrong, or in an interview when people say like, name some of your failings, and you're like, oh, unless you're totally prepared for that question, you balk for a moment, and you might get a little hot under the collar as you start to think about your failures, and you think to yourself, how do I write a failure, how do I tell them a failure that is honest enough but doesn't make me look that bad, right? How do I dial that in? But if you give me 5 minutes to write down five things on a piece of paper, I might give you three or four. And that's why sticky notes are helpful, because we ask people to express their thoughts in a container, and it's a safe container in the same way that a meeting can be a safe container. We say like, here's what's going to happen. Everyone's going to write down three things that we think happened during this last iteration, this last sprint. What worked, what didn't work, right? It's crazy to me sometimes how utterly basic it is to do something like a retrospective, but it is hard to make people feel like what they're saying, that it's safe to say what they want to say. And it's also hard to make it feel for people like what they say will matter if you've taught them that nothing will be done with what they say. And so conversations don't just happen in one moment. Conversations spread out. I think they ripple in space and time, because in that one moment when you say to somebody like, how are you feeling, and they're like, you don't really want to know, you don't really care, um, how do
right.
you convince
And
somebody that you do?
yeah, no, and I think there's like two things that really stand out to me from what you said. And the first one is just like the idea of like the power of pause. I think that's one of the things I found really helpful about sticky notes and having people share ideas in that way is they have a moment to pause and to reflect and to place an idea and process and allow others around them the time and space to do that as well. And the second thing that I really like from what you said is the power of like an ongoing conversation. So by putting the idea or the thought up there, present sort of for everyone to see, we can ponder, we can return, we can revisit the idea, mix and match the idea.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you're right. Something so simple yet so powerful, which as it is, it usually goes.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
why do I,
so going back to like your earlier question, which we didn't actually address, which is like, what are some tips and tricks for making these
right.
conversations go better? The elements of the OS, like the people interface, cadence, turn taking, invitation. These are like really, really basic components that are applicable for our individual conversations as well as for our group conversations. So, who are the people in the conversation? Who do we invite to a workshop, a meeting, a sprint? Who's in my inner conversation and why? Just doing a stakeholder mapping or a stakeholder analysis of who's at the party can help. And then asking yourself, do we have everybody we need there? Um, this is where, you know, I talk about Janet way too much. She's my lovely fiance, and she actually has
Aw.
an inner committee piece of paper up on the wall of who's in her inner committee, and I'm actually in her inner committee, which I'm like scared and flattered by. And she loves my work. I love her work, and I have her voice in my head, and she has my voice in her head, right? So we can invite people into our conversation that we've never had before and say, like, what would, you know, the wisest version of Daniel do? Like, I could invite the wisest version of myself into a conversation if I describe to myself the wisest version of myself, and then say, like,
So I love
what would
that.
I say? Right?
Can I yeah, no, can I pause you for a minute? Because I
Absolutely.
don't think I caught that before. So you're saying, like, for example, people then don't always have to be physical people that you're actually working with, actually meeting with. These could also be people that you aspire to be, your future self, or just people, if this person was in the room, this is what it might be like.
Yeah, well, so think about like any design thinking workshop we would have. There's the people in the meeting, and then there's the people who are not in the meeting, but who are still somehow present. And
Right.
that might be stakeholders that we try to represent through empathy maps, personas. So we think about the customers, even though they're not there. And so there are people who are physically there, but there are a lot of people who are not physically there who are still present. And so I think that
Absolutely.
is also true with ourselves, right? How many times have you been in a conversation with somebody and they're like, well, this is what my mother always said,
All
right? My
right.
mother's in my head.
Absolutely. Yeah. Or, just, I mean, that can really even go to just like society's norms and things like that. And
Yes, our
really,
ancestors, right? That's
right.
where that. So that's that's what I have this very weird vision of conversations where they're actually like they propagate in both directions infinitely, right?
Yeah,
Because all the conversations we've ever had are still reverberating in us, right?
absolutely. Balance, I think, can be so challenging for so
Yeah.
many. Okay. So walk us through some of the other elements I know we have nine. Walk us through some of the other elements of your Canvas OS to make up a conversation.
Well, so like let's go to Amanda Palmer's dinner, like because we can actually unpack them pretty nicely from that. That
Perfect.
dinner table conversation was different because they wrote it all down, right? They changed the interface of the conversation,
Okay.
right? And conversations have a place. They exist in space and time. And the place you have the conversation in supports the conversation or not,
Right.
right? Have you ever tried to have a meeting in a loud room or a room without a whiteboard? Shock horror. Like you're like, I can't have this meeting without a whiteboard. Like we don't have Sharpies. Like, what are we going to do? Um, and so the interface, the place either supports the conversation or not.
Right.
And that's so like those are we've talked about people, right? Who's in the conversation and why? Who do we want to disinvite? Who do we want to
Hmm.
include? uh the interface of the conversation, like, is it, I think of it as broadband or narrowband interfaces. Like, because right now we turned off the video, right? And that's so that we
Right.
actually have a um, more bandwidth for just the audio to be recording well, but you're not getting any visual information from me. So we actually, in
Right.
some ways, we have we could have this conversation over texting. It would just be a lot slower, right? But texting is the best interface if you're bar hopping. I say this
Right.
all the time. I don't think I'm the only person who's ever been angry with a friend of mine for calling me when a text would suffice.
Oh, absolutely. I actually, when I record the intro for this, that's actually one of the things I talk about because, communication platforms in general are so fascinating compared to other areas of technology where something new comes and it almost eliminates what we previously used. For example, like I think like maps and navigation is a great
Yeah,
example. Whereas communication, we still mail letters and cards. We still pick up the phone. We still talk face to face, but there's all these other layers of social media and texting and FaceTime and Zoom calls and all of this that have been brought into the mix that how do you strike that balance
yeah,
and really know when and where is best to kind of even within a text or even within an email, the construction of that alone can be
yes,
so daunting for so many
yes.
that, that's again why I just find this conversation so fascinating because it's not like as if like a new technology has come, great, that's the only one we're going to focus on now and all the others have become obsolete. This is one that is becoming more and more and more complex by the day almost.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
So I would really love for you to dig into your error and repair because so many of us when having conversations, the first thing that happens is when you leave or when it's over is, oh my God, I wish I had said this, or oh no, I wish I could take something like that back. So
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about the error and repair.
I mean, it's non-trivial. Um, in a workshop setting, it's it's pretty easy to be able to say to people, "Hey, what kind of behavior do we want to support, and what kind of behavior do we not want to support, and what will we do if we don't get that type of behavior?" And this is called in some circles designing the alliance. So if we say, I don't want to have any phones or laptops, I want everyone to be present here the whole time we're together. People say, sure, sure. And I say, well, okay, what can I do if you're not doing that? Right? What is the repercussion for the error? How do I repair it? How do I fix it? And I've been in situations where there hasn't been an opportunity to have that really intentional moment to make sure that that's what everyone agrees to, or even if you do, that there's not some senior dude who just sort of like takes his phone out of his pocket while the team is pitching out their final idea that's coming at the end of a 12-week design sprint. And so what can I do to that guy? What I
Mhm.
did with this particular man was I actually just walked over to him and I just put my hand on his shoulder really lightly. I used physical touch. I used my physical presence. Now, he's a white man and I'm a white man, and so, it was a safe touch. It was on the shoulder. I don't know if I would have done the same thing, with a lady, perhaps, because that could be read as intimidation. But with him, it seemed like the right thing to do with the guy who was, asserting his power and his importance by not needing to be fully present, that the lightest touch was, bringing him into the present room and actually reminding him that this was important as well. That's how I decided to repair that situation, to get him back in the present moment, because we needed his feedback. He was like the senior member in the room.
Right. And, it's just so interesting listening to you kind of break down these different elements. You really begin to realize how a conversation is not when you open your mouth, like, and start a meeting or start that agenda that you have planned. So much of it is all of the prep work that goes into what outcome are you really hoping for from the conversation and just that intentionality.
Yeah, but even if you make the perfect prep, you can't guarantee that someone will, uh, not slip out their phone,
Right.
because we're addicted to them. And so, like, there are ways to, and in the book, and you can Google this, like the Greater Good Project. I'll find the link for you, or it's in the book. We can dig it up. Like, there's actual science that around how to say you're sorry. right? There's actually psychologists have actually researched this, where like, how do you say you're sorry to somebody in the best way possible? And we've all experienced the opposite, where you're like, I'm sorry that you are hurt, that I think that I bothered you, that I hurt you and I annoyed you. You're like, that's not a real apology.
Right.
All right, we know we know what a fake apology feels like, and there's actually science that goes to saying like, hey, a real way of repairing something going wrong is acknowledging the other person's feelings, acknowledging that something unexpected happened that they weren't happy with. Right? It's acknowledging some form of personal responsibility instead of just being like, no, I'm sorry, you feel bad about it. I didn't do anything wrong. Right? There are ways to repair errors that are appropriate,
Yeah.
but as you say, the more you prep, the clearer you make the container, the clearer the agreements are for why we're here in the room, then the easier it is to repair the any bumps that happen along the way.
Absolutely. And I think it's really nice also to just be able to acknowledge that, this may not go perfectly because like I said, a lot of us I think are dealing with, change and just, things that are all that are new that sometimes just internally make us uncomfortable. So just being able, I think, even have the space and awareness of, things may go wrong, things
Oh, they will go wrong.
they
They
will go
absolutely.
wrong.
Right.
Absolutely.
You will be misunderstood.
Right.
That's another thing that's important to realize, is that just as surely as you have to have people in the conversation, they will misunderstand each other in some way, shape, or form, because there's no such thing as a perfect communication.
Right. So let's transition a little bit. I know we started off kind of, and we've mixed and weaved in a few of these different items, but I did want people to get a really clear sense of like sort of how you had kind of organized the book and just your thinking, because I love this idea of taking it from, like an individual and how we have conversations, but also how the things we create, products, and just even organizations as a whole, you said, are a conversation with the world. So
Yeah,
walk
yeah.
us through products and teams and then move us into organization.
Sure. Yeah, well, so I mean, in the book, and in my understanding, like I interviewed um a gentleman by the name of Paul Pungara, who's a professor of cybernetics, and they're modeling a one-to-one conversation, because that's actually the easiest and clearest conversation to see. I talk, you talk, you talk, I talk, I listen, we transact, we agree or disagree at some point. And if you just, instead of having one person and one person on either side of the interface diagram, it's like, I'm here, you're there, we're having this conversation through this laptop that I have here, right? I could be here, and on the other side of the Zoom call could be 10 or 15 people,
Right.
right? And then the conversation that I'm having with them is what? Like, I'm teaching, I'm presenting, I might be facilitating them. And so that dialogue that I'm having with this group of people, that I'm trying to design their conversation with each other, with me, right? So it's that's the one to a group conversation that
Right.
I would call facilitation. But if I'm a designer, right, and I make a product and I put it in the world, the classic lean uh, mantra is make, test, learn, or make, test, and reflect. And just like we want to have reflection for ourselves, right, to know what we know and think what we think, a designer needs to make something. Real artists ship, thanks Steve Jobs, right? So we ship something into the world, and then we go and listen to it. We listen to the people. What's the word on the street? What's the conversation? What are people saying? And I thought I was the only one who thought of products in this way, but I finally got around to reading Jeff Gothelf and Josh Seiden's Sense and Respond, and they straight up talk about this process of sensing and responding from to the market as a conversation. And so I was like, oh, this is great. It's not just me. I'm not crazy. And I talked to a friend of mine who is the what is his role? He works at Citibank, and he's the like the lead internal innovation person. And he was like, every pixel we make is an opportunity to listen to our customers,
Oh, wow. I
right?
love that.
Every pixel we make is either a missed opportunity to listen, or a really we've really capitalized on that opportunity to not just make stuff and make products, but to listen to what people are doing and saying with them, and making something better with what they create. And I think a lot of products and services in the world are hilariously one-sided
Oh,
because
absolutely.
they think they don't need to listen to people and what they need anymore. And usually they can get away with it for a little while when markets are slow, but eventually somebody will serve their needs more rapidly, more deeply, and better because they're listening more deeply.
I mean, I could not agree more. And I think, this is why, again, I think that some of the work that you're presenting and your book is so powerful because we are not used to thinking about things in this way. It's sort of always been, I mean, yes, conversations individually with just like you said, one on one is always been a back and a forth. But really
Yeah.
now, as we expand to think about products, to think about organizations, it has predominantly been one sided. But I would say,
Oh yeah.
I'd love your thoughts around this too. But really, for me, I kind of see like the rise of social media and just like all these people now being able to, it's just really democratized, I think, access to who speaks about what and how we listen and how we, I think, just have more access to information for better or for worse that
Yeah.
force us
Yeah.
almost into having to be two-sided.
Well, very, very well, multi-sided in this case. Like just going back to that ridiculous example of the kid ordering his meal
Right?
in that restaurant, like nobody could stop him from ordering his meal, not even by kicking him in the shins. And now we have, as you say, platforms where anybody can speak anytime, and there's tons of uh, places where you can. And Glassdoor is just only one of the most reputable places where you can go to tell the world what you like or don't like about where you work. Where you don't have to wait. There's totally disintermediated conversations
Right.
where people can have directly with each other, anybody, everywhere, all over the world, and that's the reality, which makes it very hard to, if information wants to be free, and information is power. It's very hard to hold power in the old ways that we do. And so that's why I think we need a new type of leadership for this new era, which I and some other people would term conversational leadership, although I don't know if we all agree on what conversational leadership is. I think being able to shape conversations at all of these scales that we're talking about, just not just in dialogue and not just facilitating teams and not just designing an org chart, but like how do you have the conversation with yourself? How do you manage the conversation with the market? These are all dialogues at like the whole scale that require presence of mind to manage.
What are some of the things you think people can do? So, for example, you're in a more traditional leadership role, or maybe just the concept is fascinating to you. Maybe you enjoy having conversations and talking with people. What are some of the things that you think can allow people to sort of enhance their abilities in becoming a conversational leader?
Whoa. I mean, ironically, listening better. I believe that the one of the quotes in the book that I'm delightfully fond of is from Uma Thurman's character in Pulp Fiction. She says, "Do you listen or do you just wait to speak?"
Oh,
And I think a lot of us are just waiting to say our turn. And deep listening is really rare and really powerful. And the more we listen to people, the more we can actually respond to them intelligently and meaningfully. And so I think deep listening, we think speaking is what's powerful, but listening is just as powerful. Is like
absolutely.
doing versus being versus non-being. This listening, deep listening, can really hold somebody. And when people talk about, how do you deal with difficult people, I say listen to them. Actually listen to them. It can diffuse things magically. You can find out what people are really about. So I think listening is one of the most powerful things that we can do. And the other is just being more comfortable with being visual. I think making our conversations and our communications more visual makes everything more immediate and makes everything more fluid. This joke of are we on the same page is very much easier to answer if we're literally on the same page.
Yeah, and it was funny as you were describing that first part of it about, I immediately thought back to our conversation just a little while ago about, making conversations visual, giving people that time and space, and placing the ideas in a visual way that really I think allows for that. And it's also one of the things that I think is again democratizes who gets a voice at the table and who can really kind of step into these different roles is based upon your ability to listen.
Yeah, yeah. I I think listening is absolutely key, and I think the third is ironically storytelling. Perhaps we didn't really talk too much about the narrative structure behind a conversation, but I'm deeply passionate about conversations. Basically, are stories that we're telling together. When we leave a conversation, we tell a story about what happened, and we don't give the blow by blow. We're left with, oh, this is what it was about, and being able to hold the thread of the conversation together in a way that is coherent and that people leave with a message that you prefer. That's a really powerful skill. That's the power of storytelling.
Absolutely. And speaking of storytelling, kind of I'm always intrigued by, that Simon Sinek, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. But I was
Yes.
thinking the other day about how, like, he said that over a decade ago, before most of these social platforms really existed. And again, I think
Mm,
another reason why, like, I'm a really big believer in really getting people to understand that just because somebody else is having a conversation around a topic, you have space, you have the space and power to do so as well, and it doesn't take away from anything anybody else is doing, nor will it take away from anything you plan on doing. Because I think,
mm.
kind of with those social platforms, one extended step is you need more and more people to advocate for what your why is. So tell me a little bit about organizations as conversations, because that Simon Sinek quote is one I think that really resonates with so many people.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an org design expert by any means, but I do see the organizations that I work with as you might describe them as like a river of conversations. If you've ever looked at a map of a river delta with all these little rivulets sort of moving around and recombining, we need to know where the conversation's going, right? The conversation should be going somewhere.
Right.
It isn't just flowing around aimlessly. And there are certain flows in an organization that are easy and there some are hard. It's really hard to swim upstream to go against whatever that flow is. I think that's one of the challenges that I see in organizations is that there's literally some people you're not supposed to talk to. And when you're not allowed to talk to your customers, or when you're not allowed to use certain words, or when the vocabulary inside of the company is just complete and utter garbage. Uh, I posted an article that somebody else wrote about this on Vulture recently, where we literally get together in meetings and a company has a culture where you're like, let's put a pin in that, or let's double click and let's circle back around, and let's you know, none of these words mean anything. When I'm a consultant and I go into an organization, they are they have this whole internal vocabulary that they think makes it easier for them to communicate, but actually hides so much meaning. I think learning how to speak in plain language would be such a boon for most of these organizations, to just literally say what they mean, right? Not to say like, I don't have bandwidth for that. Say like, I don't have time for your request because I'm at 100% right now.
Right.
And to be able to have that conversation, which is not easy to have, to say, what would you like me to deprioritize in order to prioritize what you're asking me to look at, right? So that's a very different conversation than the ones that organizations normally have.
Absolutely. Would you say that it starts with the individuals, that it's more of a bottom up approach versus a top down, or could it go either way?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm a middle out fan from the early days of. I don't know if you've ever watched. It's a terribly crude joke from Silicon Valley, from the first season.
I
So I apologize for making
haven't.
it.
So many people have told me about that, and I just has just not been able to get to it.
You can Google it. We won't get into it. I think it's wrong. Like the whole point. One of the suppositions of holacracy, for example, is that whoever is nearest to the customer knows the most about the problem, and that those people who are close to the problem should be given freedom to act quickly to address whatever challenges that they're seeing.
Do you see
But
that
then, of course,
becoming more of a norm?
I think that's becoming more part of the rhetoric. I don't think that's I don't think that's normal at all.
Yeah.
I think that's actually really hard to do
Right.
because there's not a lot of trust in a lot of instances where you're like, well, how much money are we going to enable our frontline employees to give back to the customer in order to placate them, right? How many discount codes are they, like, how much are they allowed to just wave away and fix? And that's giving them a lot of power versus making them like go up the chain and say, we'd like to do this, like, is it okay for me to give them a 50% discount because we really screwed this up for them? And by that point they've posted it all over social media.
Yeah.
So it's by no means trivial, and it's not easy at all.
Right.
I think power is still seen as coming from the top down. We still believe that organizations are managed from the top down because they are. um, because organizations are organisms, and they try to keep themselves together and coherent, and that means that we want the quote unquote brain of the organization to be in charge, not the fingers and the toes.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Daniel, to wrap this up, because I've taken so much of your time already, tell me, like, two things that you hope people take away from your book.
Oh man. Well, I hope that people actually think about their own ability to shape their conversations for the better, right? Like that they can take responsibility for shaping them in such as a way that they believe they should go. The last page of the book is that, like, the world needs your conversational leadership. It doesn't know it, but it does.
Right.
Right. And so what I would like everyone to believe is I can create a more ideal world through intentionality, which is an incredibly naive thing to think, but I think it anyway. The other thing is that I hope that people start drawing their conversations as a way of mapping out what they intend and what they hope will happen with another person. And that's a great way to invite other people into the conversation you want them to have. Right. So when we talk about building shared vision for a dialogue, drawing a map for somebody is a great way to describe the journey you want to go on together with them. And this is true for a conversation as well as for a vacation. And so I hope that people actually come away doodling. I thought about paying somebody to be a better doodler in the book. My doodles are pretty average, but I left them in there because I want people to feel comfortable with doodling their own dialogues, inner and outer, and to get more comfortable with that way of communicating with themselves and with other people, because I think it's really powerful. So those are the two takeaways. Like, you can do it, and start drawing.
That is so beautiful. And I love that, because I think you dived so deep into how you can actually bring those to fruition and how you can practice those strategies better throughout the conversation that we had today. So it was actually a really beautiful way, I think, to kind of wrap that up. Daniel, if people want to learn more from you, connect with you, chat with you, where can they find you, or where do you prefer to have people meet you?
Well, if you want to find me on the internet, that's one place to
exactly
find
what I mean. Where can we?
You can hunt me down on the internet. You can find me at theconversationfactory.com, which is where my podcast and the book all live. And if you want to find me in real life, I'm in New York City, and I'm often at the Norwood Club. You can always stop by and knock on the door, try to have coffee with me.
Daniel, thank you so much for your time today. I'm so excited for people to be able to read your book, learn more about your work, and wish you all the best.
It's your turn to join the conversation by sharing what you enjoyed or what questions you still have. In a world where time and attention are so valuable, thank you for choosing to listen and for being a part of our Sprint to Success with Design Thinking community.